They showed up at my doorstep with designer handbags and fake smiles, threatening to demolish my family's cabin, without realizing they were standing on land I legally owned. That was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. It was war. It had been less than a week since I returned to Cedar Ridge Lake, a quiet patch of forest in northern Oregon, hoping to spend the summer reconnecting with nature and finishing my wildlife memoir. I'd just wrapped up 5 years leading endangered species field research in Patagonia, and after all that time chasing condors through the Andes, I was ready for stillness, solitude, a break. The cabin had belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Harper. She passed away in 2019 and left it to me. A modest A-frame nestled beneath towering pines, surrounded by birdsong and the shimmer of lake water, the kind of place that smells like cedar and memory. I grew up here, every summer, learning the names of trees before I could spell my own. So when I inherited it, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't just land, it was legacy. But apparently, not everyone saw it that way. It started on a Tuesday morning. I just set up my telescope by the dock, documenting a rare species of coastal kestrel I thought had vanished from the region. I was mid-note when I heard the low rumble of multiple SUVs crunching up the gravel path. I turned, squinting against the sun, and saw them. 5 women in coordinated athleisure wear, all tanned skin and Botox, descending from their Range Rovers like they were arriving at a movie premiere. The one in front was clearly the ringleader. Tall, mid-50s, platinum blonde bun so tight it looked painful, big sunglasses, bigger attitude. She didn't introduce herself, just held out a pink envelope like it was a warrant. "You're in violation of multiple aesthetic guidelines," she said crisply. "Cedar Ridge Lakeside Association has determined your dwelling is non-compliant with community visual standards and must be corrected or removed within 30 days. I blinked. "I'm sorry, what association?" "The Cedar Ridge HOA," she replied, gesturing to the women behind her who were already snapping pictures of my solar panels, my canoe, even my weathered welcome mat. "You are currently occupying a structure within our jurisdiction that does not align with our development plan." I looked down at the paper in my hands. HOA violation notice. I'd seen one before, when my friend had to repaint her house in Arizona for using the wrong beige. But I'd never imagined I'd get one in the middle of the forest. "My grandmother built this place in 1972, I said slowly, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening. "There weren't any developments here then. This land has been in my family for nearly 50 years. The woman tilted her head, as if I were a confused child. "Boundaries were redrawn when the association was formalized 2 years ago," she said, and snapped her fingers. A man stepped forward, late 40s, fake tan, crisp button-up shirt like he was on his way to sell me a condo. "This is my husband, Trent. He handles our documentation." Trent didn't say hello. He just held up his phone and started filming. "As you can see, our community is currently dealing with a significant eyesore," he said into the camera. "This structure is reducing lakeside property values by an estimated 18%. I stared at him. Was he live streaming this? "This isn't a resort," I said. "It's my home." That's when she handed me the thick laminated binder. Cedar Ridge Design and Compliance Manual, the cover read. Inside, page after page of pastel renderings and instructions for things like mailbox height and window symmetry. "You'll need to replace that dock, repaint the cabin, and remove any unapproved scientific equipment," she said, pointing to my tripod and field journals like they were contraband. "Also, Personal watercraft are prohibited unless stored in the community boathouse. I felt heat rising in my chest. This is private property. I'm not part of your HOA. She raised a sculpted brow. That's not how our map reads. That map. That damn map. I looked past her, across the water. The kestrels were still there. 2 of them, perched on the far shore, preening in the sunlight like they knew they were the last of their kind. My grandmother had once told me, "The lake chooses its guardians." That felt poetic back then. Now, it felt like a challenge. As the group turned to leave, snapping final fixtures of my bird feeders and compost bin, Trent muttered something about documenting the transformation for social content. The others laughed. They didn't see a home. They saw a campaign. But what none of them realized, what would come to ruin their plans, was this. I didn't just own the cabin. I owned the land under their SUVs, the gravel lot they parked in, the shoreline they thought was theirs, even a slice of the lakefront where they dreamed of building a cocktail pier. It all still belonged to my family. My grandmother had sold parcels years ago, yes, but not everything. And more importantly, I had the paperwork to prove it. As their engines disappeared back down the road and the dust settled around my boots, I unfolded the notice again. Non-compliant structure. Environmental violation. Unauthorized research activity. I wasn't just being pushed out. I was being erased. So I did what any biologist raised by a stubborn Oregon grandmother would do. I went inside. I opened the cedar chest where she kept old maps and deeds, and I started digging. Not just for documents, but for the kind of ammunition that could stop a bulldozer in its tracks. Because they thought I was a recluse. What they didn't know was that I had every legal right to protect this land, and I was just getting started. That night, with only the hum of crickets and the soft rustle of pine needles outside my window, I spread everything out on the floor. The maps, the deed copies, Grandma Eleanor's handwritten notes in faded blue ink. I hadn't opened the cedar chest since the funeral. It still smelled like her perfume. Rose and something woodsy. Like time had stopped inside. I didn't know what I was looking for exactly, but something she said once kept echoing in my mind. If they ever come for the lake, make sure they know who it belongs to. At the time, I thought she meant that figuratively. Now, I realized she meant it literally. Just before midnight, I found it. Tucked behind a folded map of the Western Bank was a small envelope labeled, "For Callie. Only when it matters." My heart skipped. I opened it slowly, careful not to tear the paper. Inside was a key. A short brass key, old, with a little tag attached. Hearthstone backside. I grabbed a flashlight and went to the stone fireplace in the main room. I felt ridiculous, tapping on bricks like I was in a mystery novel. But then, I heard it. A hollow thud. The stone shifted, revealing a hidden compartment barely bigger than a shoebox. Inside, a metal safe, dusty and cold. The key fit, and inside that was everything. Dozens of yellow documents, detailed surveys, hand-drawn boundary maps of Cedar Ridge Lake, copies of state land registration, and most importantly, original property deeds. All in Eleanor Harper's name, showing ownership of not just our cabin lot, but several acres of shoreline, the western edge of the lake, and a large rectangular parcel labeled Community Use Parking, Leads Access Only. Leased, not sold. They didn't own it. The HOA didn't own any of it. I sat there for a moment in stunned silence, heart racing. Not only were they trespassing, they were building luxury homes, running power lines, laying irrigation, all on land they didn't legally control. But that wasn't the only thing in the safe. There were also field journals, dozens of them. My grandmother had been cataloging bird species at Cedar Ridge for decades, not as a hobby, as research. It turns out Eleanor wasn't just a lake hermit who liked feeding birds. She was a self-trained ornithologist who'd been tracking the coastal kestrel population since 1984. She documented migration paths, nesting behaviors, feeding patterns, and even confirmed sightings during years when the state considered the species functionally extinct in the wild. This wasn't just family property anymore. It was a sanctuary. By sunrise, I'd filled half a notebook, cross-referencing her work with recent wildlife protection laws. The moment I hit the right search terms, my jaw dropped. If her data was accurate, and I had no reason to doubt it, then Cedar Ridge Lake was an active habitat for a federally protected species. That changed everything. But I needed help, and fate delivered. Later that morning, while I was sketching a rough boundary map with coffee in one hand and a highlighter in the other, I heard footsteps on the porch. I looked up and saw someone standing there, mid-30s, curly black hair, olive skin, wearing hiking boots and a windbreaker with a Sierra Club patch. She knocked once, then waved through the screen. "Hey, sorry to barge in. I'm Jordan Alvarez. Just moved in across the lake in one of the modern eco-cottages." She rolled her eyes. "Think you and I might be the only ones under 60 here?" I laughed despite myself. "I believe it." She extended a hand. Firm grip. "I saw what happened yesterday. The welcome committees in." "Yeah, they've got charmin' bulldozers," I said. She grinned, then glanced behind me at the table full of papers. "Are you organizing a coup, or," she asked, "trying to keep them from tearing this place down?" I told her everything. The false violation notice, the old deeds, the birds. She listened quietly, nodding, occasionally scribbling something into a notebook she'd pulled from her bag. When I finished, she leaned back and crossed her arms. "You're sitting on a bombshell," she said. "Not just a legal one, an ecological one. If you've got documentation of endangered nesting activity here, the HOA can't touch this land, and if they try, they're not just bullies, they're criminals." That's when she told me she was an environmental attorney. "I specialize in conservation easements," she said. "It's why I bought that house, to be near nature, not neon lawns and fake beaches. And now they want me to dig up my wildflowers for turf grass. They even told me to remove my rain barrels." Then I couldn't believe it. "We need to act fast," she continued, "because if those birds are nesting and the HOA tries to improve the shoreline..." Just then we heard a low rumble. We stepped outside. Across the lake, a construction crew had arrived. Excavators. Orange barriers. Workers in neon vests. And leading the charge, Victoria in a flowing cream trench coat, barking into her phone. Trent was beside her, phone raised like he was filming a reality show. I grabbed my binoculars and scanned the shoreline. They were staking flags right at the edge of the kestrel nesting site. My stomach dropped. "We have to stop them," I said. Jordan already had her phone out, filming. "I'll get everything on record," she said. "Let them hang themselves." As we headed down the path, she added, "You're not alone in this, Callie. They picked the wrong cabin to mess with." And as we walked toward the sound of machines tearing at the earth, I knew this fight had just changed. It wasn't about my home anymore. It was about everything it stood for. The meeting room at Cedar Ridge Clubhouse looked like someone had tried to teleport a country club into the middle of the woods, and missed. White pillars, marble tile, oversized chandeliers that didn't match the exposed pine beams. a barista stand in the back with oat milk lattes. It was absurd. Jordan and I showed up fashionably late, not by accident. We walked in during a slideshow. There, projected in full color, was my cabin. Except not as it is, no. In the rendering, my home had been replaced by a sleek lakefront observation center, complete with glass walls, a paved path, and something labeled a guided wildlife experience platform, whatever that was supposed to be. At the podium stood Victoria. Phase 1 of the Cedar Ridge Beautification Plan is already underway, she announced, voice dripping with faux enthusiasm. We're creating a luxury experience for our residents while preserving nature in a controlled and visually pleasing manner. Behind her, Trent floated through the crowd like a ghost with a gimbal, filming residents' reactions. "This is going to make great content," he whispered to someone, waving his phone. And then came the twist. Victoria clicked to the next slide, a grainy photo of me standing outside my cabin. "Unfortunately, we've encountered resistance from the occupant of the structure you see here. Mr. Foster, sorry, Miss Harper, has refused to comply with visual standards and has been observed conducting unauthorized wildlife activity on the premises." The crowd murmured. Some turned to look at me. Jordan put a calming hand on my arm. "Not yet," she whispered. We waited, watched, until the Q&A. Then Jordan stood. Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "Jordan Alvarez," she said loud and clear, "new homeowner on East Birch Trail. I have 2 questions. 1, why does your marketing brochure promise untouched wilderness when you plan to replace it with floating docks and cocktail bars? And 2, she paused, letting the silence settle. Has the HOA disclosed to residents that the lake and parking lot are not legally HOA property?" The room froze. Victoria's smile cracked for the first time. "Miss Alvarez, this isn't the forum for—" "It is exactly the forum," Jordan interrupted, "especially since you've already begun construction on land you do not own." Gasps, murmurs. That's when the doors at the back of the room opened, and in walked Mr. Harris. 74, retired federal judge, and more importantly, my grandmother's oldest friend. He didn't need to say much, just cleared his throat and said, "I can confirm what Miss Alvarez just stated." The room fell silent. Eleanor Harper maintained ownership of the lake and the parking area through a conservation easement established in 1993, he continued. The HOA has been using that land under a 30-year lease agreement, which expires, he glanced at his watch, in 72 days. All hell broke loose. "Wait, what? Are we parking on private land? Can she block us from the lake?" Questions flew. Phones came out. Even Trent stopped filming. Victoria banged the podium. "This meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. When the truth was out, the residents were no longer just an audience. They were participants now. Concerned, confused, and very much awake. As people began filing out, one woman lingered. White hair in a tight bun, glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She wore a name tag that read, Janet, HOA Secretary. "Ms. Harper," she said softly, "there's something you should know." I turned. She glanced around, then handed me a manila folder. "I've been keeping copies of HOA emails and board minutes for the last 10 years, she said. "Victoria's been working with outside investors. There are plans for a full resort, hotel, spa, private docks. And your cabin? It's right where they want the main lodge." My stomach dropped. Janet looked genuinely uncomfortable. "They never verified property lines. They just assumed." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because I think we made a mistake. And I don't want to see this place ruined. He turned and disappeared into the parking lot before I could say anything else. Jordan let out a slow breath. Looks like we have an insider. That night, back at the cabin, I stared at the moonlit lake. It looked so peaceful. But I knew better now. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. This was a full-scale land grab disguised as beautification. They were lying to the community, lying to investors, and now with their plans unraveling, they were bound to retaliate. We need to move fast, Jordan said. We will, I replied. But we're not just reacting anymore. She looked at me, curious. We're going on offense. The power went out just after midnight. At first I thought it was a storm. Then I stepped outside, and the sky was clear. No wind, no lightning. Just the dark stillness of Cedar Ridge Lake, and a silence that felt intentional. I walked to the edge of the property with a flashlight in hand. That's when I saw it. A brand new gate, tall, metal, locked. A sign hung from it. Patriarch Road, access limited to Cedar Ridge Ho, residents. They had cut me off from the main road. I was trapped, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Earlier that day, after the HOA meeting erupted into chaos, I'd returned home thinking we'd scored a win. Jordan and I had exposed the truth, brought a judge into the room, and shaken the confidence of Victoria and her inner circle. But we underestimated just how far they'd go to maintain control. Now they were retaliating. When I called the utility company to report the outage, the operator said, "Oh, someone reported that property as abandoned. We had a disconnect request." Abandoned? The next morning, I found a second pink violation notice taped to my cabin door. Unauthorized scientific activity, improper vehicle storage, property subject to inspection. My fists clenched. The gloves were off. Jordan showed up just after dawn, coffee in one hand, legal pad in the other. Her smile had vanished. "They're moving fast," she said grimly. "There's a construction crew on the west shore right now, digging right near the kestrel nesting site." I grabbed my binoculars. She wasn't exaggerating. From the edge of the dock, I saw bulldozers tearing through shrubs and native grass, workers in hard hats marking off land. And in the middle of it all, Victoria, wearing a white sun hat like she was attending a garden party. Trent, as always, filmed the chaos like it was content for his influencer reel. "They're trying to destroy the habitat," I muttered. "If they wipe out the nests, we can't prove anything." "We need evidence," Jordan said. "Real-time proof, right now." So we moved fast. That night, under cover of darkness, we set up motion sensor wildlife cameras around the remaining kestrel nests. We documented everything: coordinates, environmental conditions, and even the tracks left behind by the construction crew just feet from the nesting area. Just as we finished, my phone buzzed. It was Mr. Harris, the retired judge. "I've made some calls," he said. "A friend at the State Environmental Division is willing to issue an emergency stop work order. Temporarily. It'll buy you some time." "Time is all we need," I told him. But the HOA had no plans of slowing down. The next day, I woke to music blaring across the lake. A full-blown event was taking place on the very shoreline they'd been bulldozing. Wide tents, catering trucks, champagne flutes clinking in the sun. Jordan pulled out her phone. "It's an investor event. They're calling it a green development fundraiser." She showed me the invite. "Come see the future of Cedar Ridge, where luxury meets nature." There, on the promotional poster, was a sketch of a resort. And smack in the center of it, my cabin, with a red X through it. I didn't hesitate. With Harris beside us, we marched straight toward the event. The crowd parted as he led the way, his judge's presence still commanding respect. Victoria froze when she saw us. I stepped up to the stage as she clutched the mic. "Good afternoon," I said calmly, though my heart was pounding. "My name is Callie Harper. I'm the legal owner of this lake, the shoreline you're standing on, and the parking lot where your guests arrived. And I'm here to inform you, this land is not for sale." Gasps echoed across the crowd. Jordan raised a manila envelope. "This is a federal filing for emergency habitat protection," she said. "Cedar Ridge Lake is home to a confirmed population of endangered coastal kestrels. Continued development here is not just illegal, it's criminal." Right on cue, one of the kestrels soared overhead, its copper wings flashing in the sun. All eyes followed it. Even the most skeptical guests went silent. One of the landscape architects stepped forward, flipping through my grandmother's journals. "These observations, they're scientifically sound. This habitat's irreplaceable." Victoria tried to recover. "This is a misunderstanding. These people are trying to sabotage community progress." "Progress doesn't mean poisoning ecosystems," Jordan snapped. But Victoria wasn't done. Later that night, the sabotage escalated. We discovered a toxic sheen spreading across the water, an oily film clinging to the lake's surface. Dead fish floated at the edges. And worse, the kestrel nests were empty. They had fled. Jordan ran water samples, industrial solvents, petroleum. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. A crime. We called in environmental authorities. Local media picked up the story. Cameras rolled as hazmat crews descended on the lake. And suddenly, the narrative flipped. We were no longer the crazy cabin dwellers. We were the whistleblowers. The next morning, someone handed Jordan their phone with a look of concern. "You need to see this," they said. It was a video. Trent had posted it online. In it, Victoria sobbed on camera, claiming we were eco-terrorists, accusing us of contaminating the lake to sabotage their resort. She begged followers to support their fight against radical activists. It was pure fiction, twisted, manipulative, but effective. Jordan slammed her laptop shut. "We can't let them control the story." I nodded. "Then let's end it." That night, as the community gathered for an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, I stood before them, not as a recluse, but as a protector. A voice for the land. "I never meant to block anyone from enjoying this place," I said. "I just didn't want to see it destroyed." And as I spoke, I realized this wasn't just my fight anymore. It was our fight. Because what started as a battle over one old cabin had become a stand for everything we're supposed to protect. Started with one bird. Just after dawn, as the mist rolled off Cedar Ridge Lake and the world felt suspended in silence, a kestrel returned. Its wings glinted bronze in the early sun, cutting through the morning sky like an omen. It landed on a branch above the half-recovered shoreline, and just like that, it began rebuilding its nest. I stood there, frozen, watching. They were coming back. We hadn't lost everything. The environmental cleanup had been brutal. Hazmat teams, biologists, state inspectors, all swarming what was once a peaceful retreat, now a crime scene. Victoria and Trent had fled, leaving behind destroyed nests, dead fish, and a furious community. But the land, somehow, was holding on. With the evidence we'd gathered, the state filed multiple felony charges against the Harringtons: environmental destruction, document forgery, and fraud. Their mugshots made national news. Their luxury lifestyle brand collapsed overnight. But that wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was the shift. Neighbors who once looked at me like a problem were now showing up with gloves and trash bags, helping remove contaminated soil, planting native grasses, volunteering their weekends for restoration. Jordan worked around the clock with local conservation groups to stabilize the shoreline. Mr. Harris even led educational workshops for curious residents who wanted to learn more about the lake's unique ecosystem. Change was no longer just possible, it was happening. And then came the question, what are you going to do with the lake now? I had the legal power to shut them all out. The 30-year usage agreement for the parking lot and access paths had officially expired. I could have blocked the roads, posted private property signs, and let the gates close for good. But I didn't, because my grandmother had one more surprise for me. Mr. Harris found it while sorting through her archived documents. A notarized conservation trust, drawn up years ago but never activated. Her instructions were clear. If this lake is ever threatened and saved by the community, transfer ownership to the people who fought for it. Let them protect it. Together. He believed in them long before they believed in themselves. So I followed her lead. At the next town meeting, standing in front of the entire HOA, I held up the papers. Whew. I'm placing Cedar Ridge Lake into a permanent community land trust, I announced. It will be co-managed by environmental experts and elected residents, with strict conservation guidelines. The parking lot, the trails, the water itself, it now belongs to all of us. But only if we protect it. I wasn't sure how they'd respond, but the room erupted. Applause, hugs, even from people who'd once tried to evict me. Dorothy, the former HOA secretary, stood up and said, I move that we disband the old board and create a new one focused on stewardship, not status. Motion passed unanimously. As the weeks rolled on, something incredible took root. The lake healed. Not instantly, not completely, but piece by piece. We saw tadpoles again. Native plants sprouted. A second kestrel returned. Then a third. The sky began to fill with movement, wings slicing through the air like echoes of something we almost lost. And people changed too. The clubhouse stopped hosting fundraisers and started holding restoration seminars. Children from the local school came for field trips, their eyes wide as they spotted birds through binoculars for the first time. My cabin, once considered an eyesore, was repurposed as a research and education center. Even the name Cedar Ridge meant something different now. It wasn't a brand, it was a promise. Jordan and I moved in together. Our lives had become a blend of science, law, and wildness. She handled the land trust logistics. I taught ecological workshops. Together, we began helping other communities create similar conservation models. Because if we could do it here, others could too. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the lake shimmered like it had been painted in gold, I sat on the edge of the dock with Harris and Jordan beside me. A kestrel swooped down, snatching a fish from the shallows with practiced grace. Your grandmother would be proud, Harris said softly, not just for saving this place, but for turning conflict into connection. I didn't say anything at first, just watched the ripples spread across the water. Then I smiled. She didn't just leave me land, I said. She left me a mission. And now, it belonged to all of us. And maybe that's the real lesson here. The story wasn't just about a cabin or a lake or even a rare bird. It was about what happens when ordinary people decide that preserving something beautiful is worth more than profit, politics, or control. It was about legacy, not the kind you inherit in a bank account, but the kind you earn by standing up for what matters. Because ownership isn't just about a name on a deed. It's about responsibility. It's about community. It's about choosing to leave something better than you found it. So wherever you are, whoever you are, maybe there's a lake in your life worth protecting. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for permission and start making a difference. If this story moved you even just a little, leave a comment with 1 if you like this video, 0 if you didn't, so I can improve next time. And hey, subscribe if you believe we need more stories like this in the world. Share it if you know someone who's been quietly fighting their own battle, because sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind us what's worth saving. Thanks for watching. See you in the next story.